The AirTag was smaller than I'd expected when I slipped it into the inner pocket of Chester's leather briefcase while he showered that Tuesday morning. At 63, I never imagined I'd be tracking my husband of 35 years like some paranoid wife from a crime thriller, but Chester's behavior over the past few months had become impossible to ignore. It started with the phone calls, whispered conversations that ended abruptly when I entered the room, followed by Chester's nervous explanations about old engineering colleagues and retirement planning consultations. Then came the schedule changes. Sudden departures every Friday afternoon with vague explanations about errands and appointments that lasted exactly 2 hours. "Viv, I'll be back around 5, Chester had said that morning, kissing my forehead with the same gentle affection that had characterized our marriage since 1988. "Just need to handle some business downtown." "What kind of business?" I'd asked, noting how his jaw tightened at my question. "Nothing important, sweetheart. Just boring financial paperwork that would put you to sleep." Chester had been giving me variations of that same answer for 4 months, and I was tired of feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. After he left, I opened the Find My app on my iPhone, a technology that my grandson Jake had taught me to use for locating lost devices, and watched the small dot representing Chester's briefcase move through our suburban neighborhood toward downtown Portland. The route was familiar by now. Chester took the same streets, made the same turns, and arrived at the same destination every Friday at precisely 3 p.m., the Riverside Hotel on Morrison Street, an upscale establishment that catered to business travelers and wealthy tourists. What my 65-year-old husband was doing at an expensive hotel every week was a question that had been keeping me awake at night, creating scenarios in my mind that ranged from concerning to devastating. The most obvious explanation was infidelity. I'd seen enough daytime television and read enough magazine articles to know that affairs among older adults were increasingly common, especially after retirement, when couples found themselves spending more time together than they had in decades. Chester and I had been adjusting to retirement differently. I'd embraced the freedom to read, garden, and volunteer at the local library, while Chester seemed restless and dissatisfied with the pace of our new lifestyle. He'd made comments about feeling useless and invisible in ways that suggested he was struggling with the transition from productive professional to idle retiree. Perhaps he'd found someone who made him feel vital and desired again. Perhaps our comfortable but predictable routine had become suffocating to him in ways he couldn't express directly. The thought of Chester with another woman made me physically ill, but I forced myself to consider the possibility with the same analytical approach I'd used during my 30 years as a high school mathematics teacher. What evidence supported this hypothesis? What alternative explanations might account for his secretive behavior? Chester's Friday absences were remarkably consistent. Same departure time, same destination, same duration. If he was having an affair, it was conducted with the precision of someone scheduling medical appointments, rather than the passion of someone consumed by romantic desire. He also showed no other signs of infidelity that I'd read about in articles about cheating spouses. His appearance hadn't changed, his interest in our relationship remained steady, and his emotional availability seemed normal except for his obvious anxiety about whatever was happening on Friday afternoons. But then again, Chester had always been methodical about everything in his life. If he was having an affair, he would probably approach it with the same systematic planning he'd applied to his engineering career and our household finances. I spent that Friday afternoon trying to distract myself with household tasks while monitoring Chester's location through the Find My app. The dot representing his briefcase remained stationary at the Riverside Hotel from 3:15 p.m. until 5:05 p.m., just as it had for the past 16 weeks. When Chester returned home at 5:30 p.m., he seemed more relaxed than he'd been all week, almost cheerful in a way that made my stomach clench with suspicion. "How were your errands?" I asked, studying his face for signs of deception. "Fine, sweetheart. Nothing exciting to report." "Chester, you seem happier. Did something good happen during your appointments?" "Just nice to get out of the house and handle some business, Viv. You know how I get restless sitting around here all day." That evening, Chester fell asleep easily while I lay awake planning my next steps. If my husband was having an affair, I needed concrete evidence before confronting him about behavior that could destroy our marriage and family relationships. If he wasn't having an affair, I needed to understand what was important enough to require weekly clandestine meetings at an expensive hotel while maintaining absolute secrecy from his wife of 35 years. The next morning, while Chester worked in the garden, I searched his home office for any documentation related to his mysterious Friday activities. Chester had always been organized about financial records and important papers, keeping everything filed in labeled folders within his desk drawers. What I found confused me more than it clarified my suspicions. Hidden behind insurance documents and investment statements, I discovered a manila envelope containing dozens of bank deposit slips for an account I'd never seen before. The deposits were substantial, amounts ranging from $15,000 to $40,000, occurring monthly for the past several years. The account number was unfamiliar, and the bank was First National Downtown, an institution we'd never used for our personal finances. Our retirement savings, checking account, and investment portfolio were all managed through Columbia River Credit Union, where we'd been members since moving to Portland 3 decades ago. I photographed several deposit slips with my phone, noting the consistent pattern of large monthly deposits that coincided with Chester's mysterious Friday meetings. Whatever was happening at the Riverside Hotel appeared to involve significant money transfers that my husband had kept completely hidden from me. Some wives suspected their husbands of infidelity and discovered emotional betrayal. I was beginning to suspect that Chester's secrets involved financial activities that could be far more dangerous than adultery. Tomorrow, I was going to call First National Downtown and find out exactly what my husband had been hiding from me for the past several years. Because if Chester wasn't having an affair, then his secretive behavior suggested involvement in activities that could threaten our family's security in ways I hadn't considered. And if he was laundering money or involved in financial crimes, then our comfortable retirement was built on illegal foundations that could collapse at any moment. Monday morning brought a phone call that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my husband and our financial security. I waited until Chester left for his weekly grocery shopping trip before dialing First National Downtown, my hands trembling as I prepared to either confirm or dispel my worst fears about his secretive Friday meetings. First National Downtown, customer service. How may I help you? Hello, I'm calling about an account that may be under my husband's name. I need to verify some information for tax purposes. I'd be happy to help you. Can you provide the account number and the account holder's name? I read the account number from one of the deposit slips I'd found, along with Chester's full name and social security number that I'd memorized after 35 years of filing joint tax returns. Mrs. Hartwell, I do show an account under that number, but I'll need to verify your identity before discussing account details. Are you listed as an authorized user on this account? I'm not sure. My husband handles most of our financial arrangements, and I'm trying to organize our records after his recent retirement. The representative paused for several seconds before responding with a tone that suggested she was accessing account information that surprised her. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm showing that this account has 2 authorized signatories, Chester Hartwell and someone named Donovan Hartwell. Are you related to Donovan Hartwell? My blood turned to ice as I absorbed the implications of what the bank representative had just told me. Donovan Hartwell was Chester's twin brother who had died in a car accident 40 years ago when we were newlyweds. I'd attended Donovan's funeral in 1983, consoled Chester through months of grief, and watched him struggle with survivor's guilt for years after his brother's death. Ma'am, are you still there? The representative asked, after I'd been silent for nearly 30 seconds. I'm sorry, could you repeat that name? Did you say Donovan Hartwell? Yes, ma'am. Donovan Hartwell is listed as the primary account holder, with Chester Hartwell as the secondary signatory. The account was opened in 2015 and has maintained a substantial balance through regular monthly deposits. What kind of balance are we discussing? Mrs. Hartwell, I can't provide specific balance information to someone who isn't listed on the account, but I can tell you that this account has been very active with large deposit activity over the past 8 years. Can you tell me anything about the nature of the deposits? Business income? Investment returns? That kind of thing? The deposits appear to be cash transactions processed through our commercial banking services. Mrs. Hartwell, If you have concerns about this account, I'd recommend speaking directly with the account holders or consulting with a financial advisor. After ending the call, I sat in Chester's home office, staring at the deposit slips spread across his desk, trying to process information that contradicted everything I believed about my family's history and current circumstances. Donovan Hartwell was dead. I'd seen his body in the funeral home, watched them lower his casket into the ground, and observed Chester's devastating grief over losing his twin brother to a drunk driving accident. There was absolutely no possibility that Donovan was alive and co-managing a bank account with substantial monthly cash deposits, unless everything I'd believed about Donovan's death had been an elaborate lie. I spent the afternoon researching public records online, searching for any evidence that Donovan Hartwell had survived the 1983 car accident or had somehow returned from the dead to open bank accounts with my husband. What I discovered made me question not just Donovan's fate, but my own sanity. The accident report from 1983 was readily available through Oregon State Police records. On March 15, 1983, Donovan Hartwell's vehicle had collided with a semi-truck on Highway 26 during heavy rain. The driver had been pronounced dead at the scene, and the body had been released to Hartwell family for burial arrangements. But as I read through the details more carefully, I noticed something that had never occurred to me during the emotional trauma of planning Donovan's funeral 40 years ago. The body had been severely damaged in the accident, and identification had been made through wallet contents and dental records rather than visual identification by family members. Chester had insisted on a closed casket funeral, explaining that he wanted to remember his brother as he'd lived rather than how he'd died. At the time, Chester's decision had seemed like healthy grief processing rather than evidence of potential deception. But what if the body in Donovan's casket hadn't actually been Donovan? What if my brother-in-law had somehow staged his death and had been living under a false identity for the past 40 years? The idea seemed impossible, but it was the only explanation that could account for a dead man's name appearing on active bank accounts with substantial cash deposits. That evening, Chester returned from grocery shopping with his usual cheerful demeanor, apparently oblivious to my discovery of the secret account or my growing suspicions about his brother's supposed death. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Chester asked, while unloading groceries with the domestic routine that had characterized our retirement. "Fine, dear. Just organizing some paperwork and catching up on household tasks. You find anything interesting in all that paperwork?" Chester's question seemed casual, but I detected something in his tone that suggested more than polite conversation, almost as if he was fishing for information about what I might have discovered in his office. "Nothing too exciting. Just trying to understand our various financial accounts for tax planning purposes. Viv, you don't need to worry about financial planning. I've got everything organized and properly managed. Our retirement is secure and our investments are performing well. Chester, do we have accounts at banks other than Columbia River Credit Union?" The question hung in the air for several seconds, while Chester continued unpacking groceries with movements that had become noticeably more tense. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "I just want to understand our complete financial picture. Sometimes I feel like I don't know enough about our money management in case something happens to you." "Viv, nothing's going to happen to me. And yes, I have some business accounts at other institutions for investment purposes. Nothing you need to concern yourself with." "Business accounts? Chester, what kind of business are you involved with?" "Nothing dramatic, sweetheart. Just some consulting work I've been doing to supplement our retirement income. Engineering firms sometimes need experienced consultants for specialized projects." Chester's explanation sounded plausible, but it didn't account for the involvement of his supposedly dead twin brother or the substantial cash deposits occurring monthly for 8 years. That night, I made a decision that would either confirm my suspicions or convince me that grief and paranoia were affecting my rational thinking. I was going to follow Chester to his Friday meeting at the Riverside Hotel and observe exactly what kind of consulting work required weekly clandestine meetings while maintaining absolute secrecy from his wife. Some wives discovered their husbands were having affairs and learned to forgive emotional betrayal. I was about to discover whether my husband was involved in financial crimes that could destroy our family's security and potentially put us all in physical danger. Because if Donovan Hartwell was somehow alive and managing secret accounts with Chester, then my comfortable retirement was built on foundations that I didn't understand and couldn't trust. Friday morning arrived with the weight of decisions that would either vindicate my suspicions or reveal me as a paranoid wife destroying her marriage through baseless accusations. Chester followed his usual routine: coffee, newspaper, casual conversation about weekend plans, while I prepared for covert surveillance that felt both necessary and absurd for a 63-year-old retired math teacher. "I'll be back around 5, Viv," Chester said, kissing my cheek with the same affection that had sustained our marriage for 3.5 decades. "Just need to handle some business downtown. Drive carefully, dear." The weather forecast mentioned possible rain this afternoon. After Chester left, I spent 30 minutes preparing for surveillance operations I'd learned from crime television shows and online articles about investigating suspicious spouses. Dark clothing that wouldn't draw attention, sunglasses despite the overcast Portland sky, a baseball cap to obscure my profile, and a camera with telephoto lens that I'd borrowed from our neighbor under the pretense of photographing birds in our backyard. The drive to downtown Portland took 25 minutes, giving me time to position myself across from the Riverside Hotel before Chester's scheduled 3 p.m. arrival. I parked with clear sight lines to the hotel entrance, while remaining inconspicuous among other vehicles on the busy downtown street. At exactly 2:58 p.m., Chester's silver Honda Accord pulled into the hotel's valet parking area. I watched through my telephoto lens as my husband emerged from his car wearing the charcoal gray suit he reserved for important occasions, carrying the leather briefcase that contained the AirTag I'd planted 4 months earlier. Chester moved through the hotel lobby with obvious familiarity, greeting the concierge with casual recognition and proceeding directly to the elevator bank without stopping at the reception desk. His behavior suggested regular visits over an extended period, rather than recent meeting arrangements. I waited 10 minutes before entering the hotel, reasoning that Chester would be settled in his meeting location and unlikely to notice his wife conducting surveillance in the same building. The Riverside Hotel's lobby was elegant but not ostentatious, filled with business travelers and well-dressed locals who provided perfect cover for a woman trying to blend into expensive surroundings. "Excuse me," I said to the concierge, who'd greeted Chester. "I'm supposed to meet my colleague here for a business appointment, but I've forgotten which conference room we reserved. Could you help me locate Chester Hartwell?" "Mr. Hartwell is in Suite 1247, ma'am. The elevator bank is just behind you." Suite 1247. Not a conference room or restaurant, but a private hotel suite that suggested meetings requiring absolute privacy and discretion. I felt sick realizing that Chester's Friday activities involved private accommodations that could indicate romantic affairs or business dealings that required clandestine settings. I took the elevator to the 12th floor, my heart pounding as I prepared to discover whether my husband of 35 years was having an affair with another woman or involved in activities that could be even more threatening to our marriage and family security. The hallway outside Suite 1247 was empty and quiet, allowing me to position myself near the emergency exit stairwell where I could observe Chester's departure without being detected. Through the suite's door, I could hear muffled voices suggesting that Chester was meeting with at least one other person, though the conversation was too indistinct for me to identify words or determine the gender of his companion. At 4:15 p.m., the suite door opened and Chester emerged, followed by a man who made my legs nearly give out from shock and disbelief. The man walking beside my husband was identical to Chester in height, build, and facial features, but dressed in expensive clothing that screamed wealth and sophistication rather than the modest elegance that characterized Chester's appearance. They could have been brothers, or more precisely, they could have been identical twins. They could have been Donovan and Chester Hartwell, despite the fact that Donovan had supposedly been dead for 40 years. I managed to photograph both men as they walked toward the elevator, though my hands were shaking so badly that I wasn't certain the images would be clear enough to confirm what I was seeing. The man with Chester moved with confidence and authority that contrasted sharply with my husband's obvious nervousness and deference. As they waited for the elevator, I heard fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. "The monthly transfer needs to be completed by Tuesday. They're getting suspicious about the source documentation. If the authorities start investigating the accounts, your family's safety depends on maintaining absolute discretion." The elevator arrived before I could hear more of their conversation, but I'd heard enough to understand that Chester's Friday meetings involved financial transfers, suspicious documentation, and threats to our family's safety if details were revealed to authorities. I remained hidden in the stairwell until I was certain both men had left the hotel, then returned to my car with evidence that would either save or destroy my marriage, depending on how I chose to handle what I'd discovered. Chester Hartwell was meeting weekly with someone who looked exactly like his supposedly dead twin brother, discussing financial transfers and criminal investigations while receiving threats about our family's safety if he failed to maintain secrecy about their activities. Either Chester was being coerced into participating in illegal financial activities, or he was a willing participant in crimes that involved substantial money and potential violence against people who interfered with their operations. When Chester returned home at 5:30 p.m. with his usual relaxed demeanor, I felt like I was living with a stranger whose true identity and activities were completely unknown to me. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Chester asked, with the same gentle affection that had characterized our marriage, apparently unaware that his wife had spent the afternoon conducting surveillance that revealed his involvement in criminal conspiracy. "Fine, dear. Just a quiet day at home. Good to hear. I'm looking forward to a peaceful weekend with my beautiful wife." As Chester kissed my forehead and settled into his favorite armchair with the evening newspaper, I realized that our peaceful weekend would be anything but peaceful once I confronted him about what I'd discovered. Some wives followed their husbands and discovered infidelity that could be addressed through marriage counseling and forgiveness. I'd followed my husband and discovered evidence of criminal activity involving someone who should have been dead for 4 decades, financial transfers that suggested money laundering, and threats against our family if Chester failed to maintain his participation in illegal operations. Tomorrow, I was going to demand answers that could either save our marriage or destroy our family forever. Because the alternative to confrontation was living with a man whose secrets could put us all in mortal danger. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of deceptive normalcy that I knew would be shattered within hours by conversations that would either explain or condemn everything I'd discovered about Chester's secret life. I made coffee and scrambled eggs while my husband read the newspaper, both of us performing domestic routines that felt surreal given what I'd witnessed at the Riverside Hotel. "Chester, we need to talk about something important," I said, setting his coffee beside his newspaper with hands that trembled despite my efforts to appear calm. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" "I need to know who you were meeting yesterday at the Riverside Hotel, and I need to understand why that person looked exactly like Donovan." Chester's newspaper froze halfway to the table as my words registered. The color drained from his face with such speed that I thought he might be having a heart attack, and his hands began shaking as he set down his coffee cup with obvious effort to maintain composure. "Viv, what are you talking about? I don't know anyone at the Riverside Hotel." "Chester, I followed you yesterday. I saw you emerge from Suite 1247 with a man who looked identical to you, and I heard fragments of conversation about monthly transfers, suspicious documentation, and threats to our family's safety. You followed me? Viv, how could you? Why would you spy on your own husband?" "Because my husband has been lying to me for months about his Friday activities, and I found bank records showing an account with $6.3 million that has Donovan's name on it, despite the fact that your brother died 40 years ago." Chester stood up abruptly, pacing around our kitchen with the agitated movements of someone whose carefully constructed deception had suddenly collapsed. "Viv, you don't understand the complexity of this situation. There are things about my family that I've never been able to tell you. Secrets that I've carried for decades to protect you and our children." "What kind of secrets, Chester?" "Donovan didn't die in that car accident in 1983. He staged his death to escape federal prosecution for financial crimes he'd been committing since college." I felt the kitchen spinning around me as Chester confirmed what I'd begun to suspect, but hadn't been able to accept as reality. "Donovan faked his death? How is that possible?" "I attended his funeral, Chester. We buried him. We buried an unidentified homeless man whose body Donovan substituted for his own after the accident. Donovan had been involved with organized crime figures who helped him create false identity documents and disappear completely from law enforcement surveillance. And you've known about this for 40 years? You've let me grieve for your brother while he was alive somewhere else? Viv, I thought Donovan was gone forever. I believed that staging his death had ended our relationship permanently. I grieved for him just as much as you did, because the brother I'd grown up with had essentially died when he chose criminal activities over family relationships." Chester sat back down across from me, his face carrying the weight of deception that had apparently been crushing him for decades. Then why have you been meeting with him? Why do you have joint bank accounts? Why are you involved in whatever criminal activities he's continued pursuing? Because 8 years ago, Donovan reappeared in my life and told me that he needed my help with financial arrangements that would protect our family from people who wanted to hurt us. What kind of people? Chester's expression became even more haunted as he prepared to reveal information that would change my understanding of our family's safety and security forever. Donovan has been working as a money launderer for drug cartels operating between Mexico and the Pacific Northwest. His job involves taking cash from drug sales and converting it into legitimate investments and bank accounts that can't be traced by law enforcement. And what does that have to do with you? Donovan told me that cartel leaders had discovered his connection to me and our family. They threatened to kill you, our children, and our grandchildren unless I helped him manage financial transfers that would keep his laundering operations running smoothly. I felt sick as the implications of Chester's explanation sank in. Our family had been living under death threats from drug cartels for 8 years, while my husband participated in money laundering operations to protect us from violence. Chester, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't we contact law enforcement for protection? Because Donovan warned me that law enforcement agencies had been infiltrated by cartel informants who would alert his employers if we attempted to seek official protection. He said that our only safety came from my continued cooperation with financial operations that kept the cartels satisfied with his performance. So for 8 years, you've been laundering money for drug dealers who threatened to murder our family? I've been transferring funds and managing account documentation that helps Donovan maintain his position with people who could eliminate our entire family without hesitation or detection. Chester reached across the table to take my hands, his eyes filled with tears that I'd never seen during our 35 years of marriage. Viv, every Friday I meet with my brother who should be dead, and I participate in criminal activities that could send me to federal prison for the rest of my life, because the alternative is watching our children and grandchildren die violent deaths at the hands of people who kill families for entertainment. How much money have you laundered? Over the past 8 years, approximately $15 million in drug proceeds have been processed through accounts that I help manage. I pulled my hands away from Chester's and stood up from the table, needing physical distance as I processed the reality that my husband was a federal criminal who'd been protecting our family through participation in organized drug operations. Chester, what happens if you stop cooperating? What happens if the cartels decide they don't need you anymore? What happens if law enforcement discovers your involvement? I don't know, Viv. I've been living with those questions for 8 years, terrified every day that our family's safety depends on decisions made by violent criminals who could change their minds about our usefulness at any moment. Some wives discovered their husbands were having affairs and faced choices about forgiveness and marriage counseling. I'd discovered that my husband was laundering money for drug cartels under threat of family assassination, and that our comfortable retirement was financed by criminal proceeds that could result in federal prosecution and cartel retaliation. Our family was trapped between law enforcement and organized crime, with no safe options for escape and no guarantee that continued cooperation would protect us indefinitely. And the man I'd been married to for 35 years had been carrying this burden alone, protecting us through criminal participation that violated everything we'd believed about honesty and legal behavior. The hours following Chester's devastating revelation passed in a surreal haze of disbelief, terror, and desperate planning. By evening, we were sitting at our kitchen table surrounded by financial documents, burner phones, and emergency contact information that Chester had been maintaining secretly for 8 years. Show me everything, Chester. I need to understand the complete scope of what we're dealing with. Chester retrieved a hidden safe from behind our water heater in the basement, returning with files that documented his transformation from respected engineer to reluctant money launderer for one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America. The Mendoza cartel controls drug trafficking from Tijuana to Seattle, Chester explained, spreading photographs and organizational charts across our table. Donovan has been their primary financial coordinator for the Pacific Northwest region since 2015, which means he's responsible for laundering approximately $50 million annually. And your role in their operation? I manage the technical aspects of transferring drug money through legitimate financial institutions without triggering federal monitoring systems. Banks are required to report cash transactions over $10,000, so I coordinate multiple smaller transfers across dozens of accounts to avoid detection. I studied the bank statements Chester showed me, realizing that the $6.3 million account I'd discovered was only one component of a vast financial network designed to hide the source of criminal proceeds. How many accounts are you managing? 47 accounts across 12 banks in Oregon, Washington, and California. Every Friday, I meet with Donovan to receive instructions about which transfers to execute, which accounts to close, and which new accounts to establish. Chester, this is a federal conspiracy involving multiple felonies. If you're caught, you'll face decades in prison. And if I stop cooperating, Donovan's employers will murder our entire family to prevent us from testifying against their organization. The documents Chester showed me included detailed profiles of our children and grandchildren, their addresses, daily routines, school schedules, and workplace information that had been compiled by professional surveillance operatives. They know where Emma works, where the kids go to school, where Jake plays Little League Baseball. Viv, these people have been watching our family for 8 years, documenting our vulnerabilities in case they need to eliminate witnesses to their operations. What about Donovan? Why do they trust him enough to handle their financial operations? Because Donovan has been working for organized crime since college, long before he faked his death. He started as a bookkeeper for gambling operations and gradually developed expertise in money laundering that made him valuable to increasingly sophisticated criminal organizations. Chester showed me photographs from the 1980s depicting Donovan with known organized crime figures, documenting a criminal career that had been hidden from our family for decades. When Donovan reappeared in my life 8 years ago, he wasn't my brother asking for help. He was a professional criminal recruiting me for operations that required someone with engineering expertise and legitimate financial credentials. Engineering expertise? Chester, what does engineering have to do with money laundering? Modern money laundering requires sophisticated understanding of banking software, electronic transfer protocols, and financial monitoring systems. Donovan needed someone who could develop technical solutions for moving large amounts of cash without triggering automated federal surveillance. I felt sick, realizing that Chester's professional skills had made him uniquely valuable to criminals who'd specifically targeted him for recruitment, rather than randomly threatening our family. So this was never about protecting us from random violence. They recruited you because your expertise was essential for their operations. Exactly. Donovan presented the threat to our family as motivation for my cooperation. But the real reason they wanted me was my ability to design financial transfer systems that federal agencies couldn't detect or trace. Chester, what happens if we go to the FBI? What kind of protection could they provide for our family? Donovan warned me that federal agencies have been trying to infiltrate the Mendoza organization for years without success, which means they don't have reliable intelligence about cartel operations or adequate resources for protecting witnesses. Chester showed me news articles about families who'd attempted to cooperate with federal investigations against drug cartels, only to be murdered along with their children despite being enrolled in witness protection programs. Federal protection programs work against conventional criminals who operate within legal systems. They're less effective against international organizations that have unlimited resources for locating and eliminating witnesses regardless of official protection. So our choices are continued participation in criminal activities or probable death for our entire family. Those have been our choices for 8 years, Viv. Every Friday, I participate in felonies that could destroy our lives because the alternative is watching our children and grandchildren die horrible deaths. That evening, I called our daughter Emma using the secure communication protocols Chester had established for family emergencies. Mom, you're calling from a strange number. Is everything okay? Emma, your father and I need to discuss some family security issues that might affect you and the children. Can you and Mark come home this weekend for an important family meeting? Security issues? Mom, you're scaring me. What kind of security problems? The kind that require our family to make some difficult decisions about safety and protection. Emma, please don't discuss this conversation with anyone except Mark. And please don't use electronic communications to coordinate travel plans. After ending the call, Chester and I spent hours discussing options that ranged from continued criminal participation to immediate flight from the country to attempting cooperation with federal authorities who might not be able to protect us adequately. Viv, there's one more option we haven't discussed. What option? We could try to gather evidence against the Mendoza organization that would be valuable enough to federal authorities to justify extraordinary protection for our family. What kind of evidence? Financial records documenting their entire money laundering operation, including account numbers, transfer protocols, and organizational structure that could enable federal agencies to dismantle their financial network. Chester, if we're caught gathering evidence against them, they'll torture and kill us along with everyone we've ever loved. And if we continue participating in their operations without seeking escape, we'll eventually be caught by federal investigations and face life imprisonment while still being vulnerable to cartel retaliation. Some families face difficult decisions about job relocations, elderly parent care, or financial planning for retirement. Our family was facing decisions about whether to continue participating in criminal activities that funded drug trafficking or risk violent death by attempting to escape from organized criminals who'd been monitoring our every move for 8 years. And whatever choice we made would determine whether our children and grandchildren lived or died based on the criminal justice system's ability to protect witnesses against international drug cartels with unlimited resources for revenge. Emma and Mark arrived at our house Sunday morning with the pale expressions of parents who'd spent the entire drive from Eugene preparing for news that might endanger their children. Our son Jake was in California with his family, but Emma had convinced her husband that whatever emergency required secret communication and cryptic warnings justified immediate travel with their 2 young children in tow. "Mom, Dad, what's happening that requires such secrecy?" Emma asked, settling into our living room while Mark supervised 6-year-old Sophie and 9-year-old Tyler playing video games in the basement. Chester and I had spent Saturday night debating how much to reveal to our adult children about the criminal conspiracy that had been controlling our family's life for 8 years. Full disclosure would traumatize them and potentially put them at greater risk if they made inadvisable decisions based on fear. Limited disclosure might leave them vulnerable to threats they wouldn't recognize or understand. "Emma, your father has information about threats to our family's safety that require us to make some difficult decisions about protection and security," I began carefully. "What kind of threats? Dad, are you in some kind of trouble?" Chester took a deep breath before revealing information that would destroy Emma's understanding of her parents' quiet retirement and financial security. "Emma, for the past 8 years, I've been forced to participate in criminal activities because people connected to drug cartels have threatened to kill our entire family if I refuse to cooperate with financial operations." "Criminal activities? Dad, what are you talking about?" "I've been helping to launder money from drug sales by managing bank accounts and electronic transfers that hide the source of criminal proceeds from federal monitoring systems." Mark returned from the basement just in time to hear Chester's confession, his face registering the shock of learning that his father-in-law was involved in organized crime. "Chester, are you saying that you're working for drug dealers?" "I'm saying that drug dealers have been forcing me to work for them by threatening to murder everyone I love, including Sophie and Tyler, if I attempt to escape or contact law enforcement." Emma stood up abruptly, pacing around our living room with the agitated movements of someone processing information that challenged her fundamental understanding of family safety and security. "Dad, how long has this been happening? How long have we been in danger without knowing it?" "Since 2015, Emma. For 8 years, your children have been under surveillance by professional criminals who could eliminate them at any moment if I fail to maintain my cooperation with money laundering operations. And you never told us? You never warned us that our children were being watched by killers? Because warning you would have put you in even greater danger. These people kill entire families to prevent witnesses from testifying against their organization, and they have resources to locate and eliminate anyone connected to their operations regardless of federal protection." Mark sat down heavily in Chester's armchair, apparently struggling to process the reality that his children were living under death threats from international drug cartels. "Chester, what do we do? How do we protect Sophie and Tyler from people who have unlimited resources for violence?" Chester showed Emma and Mark the same surveillance profiles he'd revealed to me the previous day, documenting 8 years of professional observation that included our grandchildren's school schedules, playground activities, and after-school programs. These people know everything about our family's routines and vulnerabilities. They know where the children are every hour of every day, and they have operatives positioned to eliminate them immediately if I fail to comply with financial instructions. So, our choices are continued participation in criminal activities or watching our children die violent deaths? Emma asked with barely controlled panic. Those have been our choices for 8 years. But Viv and I have been discussing a third option that might provide escape without requiring our family to live under permanent threat. What option? Mark demanded. We gather evidence against the criminal organization that would be valuable enough to federal authorities to justify extraordinary protection for our entire family. I showed Emma and Mark the financial records and organizational charts that Chester had been maintaining secretly, explaining our tentative plan to cooperate with federal investigations in exchange for witness protection that would relocate our entire family to new identities in secure locations. Mom, witness protection programs are designed for individual cases, not extended families with young children, Emma protested. And there's no guarantee that federal agencies could protect us from international criminals with unlimited resources. Emma, there's also no guarantee that continued criminal participation will protect us indefinitely. These people could decide that we're security risks at any moment and eliminate us to prevent future testimony. Mark studied the financial documents with his accountant's expertise, apparently recognizing the scope and sophistication of the money laundering operation that Chester had been managing. Chester, this documentation shows financial transactions worth millions of dollars over multiple years. Federal agencies would definitely be interested in intelligence that could dismantle operations of this scale. But Mark, gathering additional evidence would require me to document activities while participating in criminal operations, which means increased risk of detection by people who torture and kill witnesses. That afternoon, we called Jake in California using secure communication protocols, explaining the family emergency without revealing specific details that could endanger him if his communications were monitored. "Dad, I'm flying home tonight," Jake announced, after hearing our carefully edited explanation of safety concerns requiring immediate family consultation. "Jake, don't use electronic communications to coordinate travel arrangements, and don't discuss this conversation with anyone except Sarah." "Dad, you're terrifying me. What kind of safety threats require such extreme security precautions?" "The kind that could endanger your children if we don't handle the situation carefully and professionally." By evening, our family was gathered in our living room discussing options that ranged from continued criminal participation to immediate flight from the country to attempted cooperation with federal authorities who might not be able to protect us adequately. "I vote for federal cooperation," Jake announced after reviewing the financial evidence Chester had compiled. "We can't continue participating in drug trafficking operations, and we can't live under permanent threat of family assassination." "I vote for leaving the country," Emma countered. "We take the children and disappear to somewhere the cartels can't reach us, and live as fugitives for the rest of our lives while federal agencies hunt us for money laundering crimes?" Mark asked. "The children's safety is more important than avoiding federal prosecution." As our family debated impossible choices, I realized that whatever decision we made would determine whether our grandchildren grew up free or spent their lives hiding from both criminals and law enforcement. "There's one more factor we need to consider," Chester said quietly. "What factor?" "Tomorrow is Friday, which means I'm scheduled to meet with Donovan for weekly financial instructions. If I fail to appear or if I display suspicious behavior, the cartel will assume that I'm cooperating with federal authorities and will immediately begin eliminating our family members. Some families planned weekend gatherings to celebrate holidays and milestone anniversaries. Our family was planning survival strategies that would determine whether our grandchildren lived to see their next birthdays. And we had less than 12 hours to decide whether Chester would continue laundering money for drug cartels or risk family annihilation by attempting escape from criminals who'd been controlling our lives for 8 devastating years. Thursday night passed without sleep for any of us as we finalized a plan that balanced family survival with the possibility of bringing down one of the most dangerous criminal organizations on the West Coast. By dawn, we'd reached consensus on an approach that terrified everyone involved, but offered the only realistic hope for long-term escape from cartel control. The FBI field office in Portland has a specialized unit that handles organized crime investigations, Jake explained, showing us research he'd conducted using secure internet connections. Agent Patricia Morrison leads operations against international drug trafficking organizations, and she has experience with witness protection cases involving family groups. Jake, how do you know this information? Chester asked with obvious concern about electronic surveillance of our communications. I used public computers at the airport and researched federal law enforcement resources without accessing any accounts or systems that could be traced to our family. Emma had spent the night researching international relocation options that would allow our family to disappear permanently if federal cooperation failed to provide adequate protection. New Zealand has immigration programs for families with financial resources and professional skills, Emma reported. We could establish residency there within 6 months if we begin application processes immediately. Emma, fleeing the country would make us federal fugitives in addition to cartel targets, Mark pointed out. And international criminals have resources for locating families regardless of geographic relocation. Our final plan involved Chester attending his scheduled Friday meeting with Donovan while wearing FBI surveillance equipment that would document cartel operations and financial activities. Federal agents would monitor the meeting from nearby locations, gathering evidence while providing immediate intervention if Chester's safety was compromised. The risks are substantial, I acknowledged as we reviewed final details. If Donovan suspects Chester is cooperating with federal authorities, they'll torture him for information about our family's location and federal protection arrangements. And if Chester fails to attend the meeting, they'll assume betrayal and begin eliminating family members immediately, Jake added grimly. At 10:00 a.m., we contacted FBI agent Patricia Morrison using procedures Jake had researched for reporting organized crime activities. Within 2 hours, Agent Morrison and 3 colleagues were sitting in our living room reviewing financial documents that represented 8 years of money laundering evidence. Mr. Hartwell, this documentation could enable us to dismantle the Mendoza organization's financial network and arrest dozens of conspirators involved in drug trafficking operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Agent Morrison explained after studying Chester's records. Agent Morrison, what kind of protection can you provide for our family during investigation and prosecution phases? We can offer immediate relocation to secure housing, new identities for all family members, federal security details for your grandchildren, and ongoing protection throughout legal proceedings that could extend for several years. And what happens if your protection fails? What happens if cartel operatives locate us despite federal security measures? Agent Morrison's expression became appropriately serious as she addressed concerns that federal agencies couldn't guarantee absolute safety against international criminals with unlimited resources. Mrs. Hartwell, federal protection programs have been successful in over 90% of cases involving organized crime witnesses. However, the Mendoza cartel represents sophisticated criminal organization with resources that exceed most domestic criminal groups. So there's a 10% chance that our entire family could be murdered despite federal protection? There's a 10% chance that standard protection protocols might require enhancement with extraordinary security measures that would significantly restrict your family's freedom and mobility. At 1 p.m., federal technicians equipped Chester with advanced surveillance equipment designed to document criminal conversations while providing real-time monitoring of his safety during the meeting with Donovan. The recording devices are virtually undetectable, Agent Morrison explained, as technicians concealed microphones and tracking equipment in Chester's clothing and briefcase. We'll monitor your conversation from nearby locations and provide immediate intervention if you're threatened or detained. And if Donovan discovers the surveillance equipment, then we'll arrest him immediately and place your family in emergency protection while preparing for probable cartel retaliation against our operations. Chester left for his final meeting with Donovan, carrying evidence that could either save our family or result in our deaths at the hands of criminals who'd controlled our lives for 8 years. Emma, Mark, Jake, and I waited in our living room with FBI agents who monitored Chester's location and conversations through sophisticated electronic equipment that provided real-time audio and GPS tracking. At 3:15 p.m., Chester's voice came through the surveillance equipment as he entered Suite 1247 at the Riverside Hotel, for what we hoped would be his last meeting as an unwilling money launderer for international drug traffickers. "Hello, Donovan. You look well." "Chester, you look nervous. Is everything all right with your family?" "Everything's fine, brother. Just tired from managing so many financial transfers lately." "Good, because I have some concerning information about federal investigation activities that might affect our operations." My heart stopped as I heard Donovan reveal knowledge of law enforcement activities that could mean our family's cover had been compromised before Chester's meeting began. "What kind of federal activities?" Chester asked with admirable composure, considering that his life and our family's safety might depend on his performance during the next hour. "FBI agents have been investigating financial institutions that we use for money transfers. They're specifically looking for patterns that indicate organized money laundering operations." "Do they suspect our accounts?" "Not yet, but they're getting closer to identifying the technical methods we use for avoiding federal monitoring systems." Through the surveillance equipment, we heard Donovan provide Chester with instructions for establishing new accounts and transfer protocols that would circumvent evolving federal detection systems. "We're also implementing enhanced security procedures for our weekly meetings," Donovan continued. "Starting next week, we'll be checking all participants for electronic surveillance equipment before discussing operational details." Agent Morrison looked at me with grim recognition that next week's meeting would expose Chester's cooperation with federal authorities and probably result in his immediate execution. "We need to arrest Donovan today," Agent Morrison announced. "If they implement surveillance detection procedures, Mr. Hartwell won't survive his next meeting." At 4:30 p.m., federal agents arrested Donovan Hartwell as he left the Riverside Hotel, ending his 40-year career as a professional criminal and beginning legal proceedings that would ultimately dismantle the Mendoza cartel's financial operations. Chester returned home that evening as a federal witness rather than a money launderer, carrying evidence that would keep dozens of drug traffickers in prison for decades while providing our family with escape from 8 years of criminal control. "Is it over?" Emma asked, as Chester embraced our grandchildren for the first time in years without fearing for their safety. "The criminal part is over," Chester replied, "but we'll be living under federal protection for several years while testifying against everyone involved in the cartel's operations." Some families spent their retirement years traveling, gardening, and enjoying grandchildren in peaceful domesticity. Our family would spend the next phase of our lives in witness protection, testifying against international drug traffickers while learning to live without fear of assassination by criminals who no longer controlled our choices. But for the first time in 8 years, our grandchildren could play in their backyard without being watched by cartel operatives who'd been documenting their vulnerabilities for future elimination. 6 months later, I was standing in the kitchen of our new home in a small town outside of Denver, watching Chester prepare breakfast with a relaxed demeanor I hadn't seen since before Donovan's reappearance in our lives. Federal protection had relocated our entire family to Colorado under new identities that would protect us during the years of legal proceedings required to prosecute the dismantled Mendoza organization. "The pancakes are almost ready, Vivian," Chester called, using my new identity name with the casual comfort we'd developed during months of practicing our cover stories and false backgrounds. I was now Vivian Barnes, married to Charles Barnes for 35 years, recently relocated from Minnesota due to my husband's consulting work with federal agencies. Our children were now David and Rebecca Cooper, with their families living in nearby towns under similar protective arrangements. "Charles, Agent Morrison called yesterday with updates about the prosecution timeline. The trials won't begin until next spring, which means we'll be living under protection for at least 18 more months. How are you feeling about the extended timeline?" "Honestly, relieved. For the first time in 8 years, I'm not terrified that our grandchildren could be murdered because of your brother's criminal activities." The past 6 months had been transformative for our family in ways that extended far beyond geographic relocation and identity changes. Chester had been receiving therapy to address the psychological trauma of 8 years spent participating in criminal activities under threat of family assassination, while I'd been working with counselors to process the betrayal and fear that had defined the later years of our marriage. "Chester, Charles, how do you feel about Donovan facing life imprisonment without the possibility of parole?" My husband paused in his pancake preparation, considering his relationship with a twin brother who'd manipulated him into criminal conspiracy while threatening the lives of people Chester loved most. I grieve for the brother I lost in 1983, when Donovan chose criminal activities over family relationships. The man who's been sentenced to federal prison isn't really my brother. He's a stranger who happened to share my DNA while dedicating his life to activities that destroyed families and communities. Do you feel guilty about his arrest and prosecution? I feel guilty about participating in criminal activities for 8 years without finding courage to seek help sooner. I feel guilty about allowing fear to prevent me from protecting our family through legal means. But I don't feel guilty about Donovan facing consequences for 40 years of criminal choices. Federal prosecutors had used Chester's evidence to secure convictions against 37 members of the Mendoza cartel, including financial coordinators, drug distributors, and enforcement operatives who'd been responsible for dozens of murders and millions of dollars in illegal drug trafficking. Agent Morrison said that your testimony helped federal agencies understand money laundering techniques that other criminal organizations have been using throughout the Pacific Northwest, I told Chester as we ate breakfast in our secure kitchen. They've been able to identify and prosecute financial crimes that might have continued for years without your inside knowledge. I'm glad that something positive came from 8 years of criminal participation. If our testimony helps prevent other families from being threatened and coerced, then maybe our suffering served some useful purpose. That afternoon, I received a call from Emma, now Rebecca, reporting that Sophie and Tyler were adjusting well to their new school and identities, despite the challenges of maintaining false backgrounds while building genuine friendships. Mom, the kids are resilient, but they sometimes struggle with remembering their cover stories during casual conversations with classmates, Emma explained during our weekly check-in call using secure communication protocols. How are you and Mark handling the transition? Better than expected. Mark's new job with the accounting firm is going well, and I'm enjoying teaching at the elementary school. It's strange living under false identities, but it's also liberating to know that our children are safe from criminal surveillance. Jake, now David, had relocated his family to a town 40 miles away, where he'd established a consulting practice that utilized his business expertise while maintaining his cover identity as someone with no connection to federal law enforcement activities. Dad, Sarah and I have been discussing whether we want more children now that we're not living under constant threat of cartel retaliation, Jake had told Chester during his last visit. For the first time in years, we can plan for the future without wondering if our family will survive to see our children grow up. The most challenging aspect of our new life involved maintaining relationships with extended family members and long-term friends who couldn't be informed about our relocation or identity changes. Chester's colleagues from his engineering career, my friends from the library where I'd volunteered, and neighbors who'd been part of our community for decades all believed that the Hartwell family had simply moved away for retirement reasons. Sometimes I miss our old life, I admitted to Chester, as we took our evening walk through the quiet neighborhood where federal protection had relocated us. I miss our garden, our house, the familiarity of routines we'd developed over 30 years in Portland. I miss aspects of our old life too, Viv. But I don't miss the fear, the secrecy, and the constant anxiety about our family's safety. This new life is built on honesty instead of criminal participation. Do you think we'll ever be able to return to normal civilian life after the trials are completed? Federal authorities have said that cartel retaliation remains possible even after convictions, which means we may need to maintain protected identities indefinitely. But Viv, this protected life with our real names and honest relationships feels more normal than anything we experienced during 8 years of criminal coercion. Dr. Martinez, the trauma therapist who'd been working with our entire family, had explained that recovery from prolonged criminal victimization often involved redefining concepts of normalcy and safety rather than simply returning to previous life patterns. Families who've survived organized crime threats often discover that their relationships become stronger and more authentic once the fear and secrecy are eliminated, Dr. Martinez had explained during our family therapy session. The shared experience of surviving extreme danger can create deeper appreciation for ordinary domestic happiness. That evening, as Chester and I sat on our new front porch watching our neighbors tend their gardens and children play in nearby yards, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation our family had undergone since I'd first placed that AirTag in Chester's briefcase. Chester, do you ever regret that I followed you to the Riverside Hotel? Do you wish I'd never discovered your meetings with Donovan? Viv, your discovery of my criminal activities was the first step toward freedom that our family had experienced in 8 years. If you hadn't been curious about my Friday meetings, we might have continued living under cartel control until federal agencies discovered our involvement through other investigations. And then we would have faced prosecution as willing participants rather than coerced victims? Exactly. Your surveillance and investigation probably saved our family from federal prosecution while providing evidence that helped convict genuine criminals instead of their victims. Some wives who followed their husbands discovered infidelity that could be addressed through marriage counseling and forgiveness. I'd followed my husband and discovered criminal conspiracy that required federal intervention to save our family from drug cartels while dismantling international money laundering operations. And our family's survival had required abandoning everything familiar about our previous life to build new identities based on honesty rather than criminal participation. 2 years after Donovan's arrest, I was sitting in a federal courthouse in Denver, preparing to deliver final testimony in the prosecution of the last Mendoza cartel operatives who'd evaded initial arrests. The courtroom was packed with law enforcement officials, federal prosecutors, and family members of victims whose lives had been destroyed by the drug trafficking organization that Chester's evidence had helped dismantle. Mrs. Barnes, please describe for the jury your discovery of your husband's involvement with the Mendoza money laundering operation, requested Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Williams, using my protected identity while guiding me through testimony that would conclude years of legal proceedings. I became suspicious when my husband began making secretive weekly trips that he couldn't explain adequately. Using location tracking technology, I discovered that he was meeting someone at the Riverside Hotel every Friday for precisely 2 hours. And what did you learn when you confronted your husband about these meetings? I learned that he'd been forced to participate in criminal activities because drug cartel operatives had threatened to murder our entire family, including our grandchildren, if he refused to help them launder millions of dollars in drug proceeds. The defense attorney for Miguel Santos, the last major cartel figure facing prosecution, attempted to portray Chester as a willing participant who'd fabricated coercion claims to avoid responsibility for criminal choices. Mrs. Barnes, isn't it true that your husband participated in money laundering operations for 8 years because the financial compensation was substantial rather than because he feared for your family's safety? No, that's completely false. My husband received no compensation for his criminal participation. The cartel threatened to kill our children and grandchildren if he refused to help them transfer drug money through legitimate financial institutions. But Mrs. Barnes, your family lived comfortably during the years your husband was laundering money for the Mendoza organization. Doesn't that suggest financial benefit from criminal activities? We lived comfortably because we'd saved money during 40 years of legitimate employment before my husband was coerced into criminal participation. Our lifestyle didn't change because of cartel involvement. It became dominated by fear and secrecy that almost destroyed our marriage. Federal prosecutors had prepared me extensively for defense attempts to portray Chester as a greedy criminal rather than a threatened victim, and I was ready to defend my husband's character while acknowledging the complexity of his situation. Mrs. Barnes, your husband could have contacted federal authorities at any time during 8 years of alleged coercion. Why didn't he seek law enforcement protection instead of continuing to participate in criminal activities? Because cartel operatives warned him that they had sources within federal agencies who would alert them if we attempted to seek official protection. They told him that our only safety came from continued cooperation with financial operations that kept their employers satisfied. And you believed these threats were credible? I believed them because they showed us detailed surveillance files documenting our children's daily routines, our grandchildren's school schedules, and our family's vulnerabilities. These weren't empty threats. They were professional assessments conducted by people who specialized in eliminating witnesses and their families. After completing my testimony, I joined Chester in the witness waiting area, where federal marshals provided security during court proceedings that had attracted international attention from law enforcement agencies tracking organized crime prosecutions. How did your testimony go? Chester asked, taking my hand with the gentle affection that had sustained our marriage through 8 years of criminal coercion and 2 years of federal protection. I think the jury understood that our family was victimized by professional criminals rather than willingly participating in drug trafficking operations. Agent Morrison said that Miguel Santos is likely to receive life imprisonment if convicted, which would mean that every major figure in the Mendoza financial network has been prosecuted successfully. The completion of cartel prosecutions would mark the end of our active cooperation with federal investigations, but not the end of our need for protective identities and security measures. Agent Morrison also said that international drug organizations sometimes seek revenge against witnesses even after successful prosecutions, I reminded Chester. We may need to maintain our protected identities indefinitely to ensure continued safety for our family. Viv, I'd rather spend the rest of my life as Charles Barnes in federal protection than spend another day as Chester Hartwell under cartel control. That evening, Emma and Jake joined us for dinner at our secure house, bringing their families for what had become weekly gatherings that strengthened relationships strained by years of fear and secrecy. "Grandma Vivian, will we ever be able to use our real names again?" asked Sophie, now 8 years old and fully adjusted to her protected identity, despite occasional confusion about family history that couldn't be shared with school friends. "Sweetheart, our safety is more important than our names. As long as we're together and happy, it doesn't matter what people call us. But I miss telling people about Grandpa Chester's engineering projects and your library volunteer work. I felt sad that our grandchildren had to maintain false backgrounds that erased decades of legitimate accomplishments and community involvement. But I also felt grateful that they could discuss future plans without fearing assassination by drug cartel operatives. Sophie, Grandpa Charles has new engineering consulting work that helps federal agencies protect other families from dangerous criminals, I explained, using language that honored Chester's cooperation with law enforcement while maintaining our security protocols. "And Grandma Vivian volunteers at the local school helping children with reading programs," Emma added, acknowledging my new community involvement that provided purpose while maintaining protected identities. Jake had established a successful consulting practice that served legitimate businesses while providing our family with financial independence that didn't depend on federal protection funds. "Dad, my business is doing well enough that I could help support the family financially if federal protection funding is reduced after the prosecutions are completed," Jake offered during our family meeting. "Thank you, son. But federal authorities have assured us that protection costs will be covered indefinitely as recognition for our cooperation with investigations that dismantled major criminal organization." 3 months later, Miguel Santos was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, marking the successful conclusion of prosecution efforts that had eliminated the Mendoza cartel's financial network. "Mrs. Barnes, your family's cooperation has resulted in the conviction of 43 cartel members and the seizure of over $200 million in criminal assets," Agent Morrison informed us during our final debriefing session. "Agent Morrison, what happens to our family now? Are we free to resume normal civilian lives?" "Mrs. Barnes, the Mendoza organization has been dismantled, but international drug trafficking continues through other criminal groups that might view your family as valuable targets for recruitment or elimination. We recommend maintaining your protected identities permanently. As our family adjusted to permanent life under federal protection, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with suspicions about my husband's Friday afternoon activities and had culminated in dismantling one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America. Chester, Charles, do you regret the loss of our previous identity and community connections? Viv, I regret the 8 years of criminal coercion that forced us to abandon our previous life. But I don't regret the courage you showed in investigating my suspicious behavior or the strength our family demonstrated in choosing justice over continued criminal participation. Some wives who tracked their husbands discovered infidelity that could be resolved through marriage counseling. I'd tracked my husband and discovered criminal conspiracy that required federal intervention to save our family while helping prosecute international drug traffickers. Our family had traded comfortable retirement in familiar surroundings for permanent protective custody in exchange for justice, safety, and the knowledge that our grandchildren could grow up without fear of assassination by criminals who no longer controlled our choices. And every evening, as we sat together in our secure house, planning futures that no longer involved criminal participation, I felt grateful for the AirTag that had started our journey toward freedom from 8 years of cartel control. 5 years after that first AirTag tracking revealed the truth about Chester's Friday meetings, I was standing in the kitchen of our permanent home in Colorado, preparing Thanksgiving dinner for a family that had grown stronger through surviving organized crime threats and federal protection. Our grandchildren had adjusted completely to their protected identities, while Chester and I had built a new life based on honesty rather than criminal coercion. "Vivian, the turkey smells perfect," Chester said, using my protected name with the natural comfort we'd developed during years of living as Charles and Vivian Barnes instead of Chester and Margaret Hartwell. "Charles, I've been thinking about how much our family has changed since that first tracking discovery. Do you ever miss aspects of our previous life? I miss the community connections and professional relationships we'd built over 30 years in Portland. But I don't miss the fear, secrecy, and constant anxiety about our family's safety that defined our final years as the Hartwells." Emma and Jake arrived with their families, bringing children who now thought of Colorado as home rather than temporary protection from threats they'd never fully understood. Sophie was now 13 and Tyler 11. Both thriving in schools where they could build genuine friendships without maintaining elaborate cover stories about family background. "Grandma Vivian, my teacher wants me to do a family history project about our ancestors," Sophie announced during dinner preparation. "What should I tell her about our background before we moved to Colorado?" "Tell her that your family came to Colorado when your grandfather retired from consulting work, and that we're originally from the Midwest, where we lived quietly before relocating for health and climate reasons." "Can I mention Grandpa's engineering career?" "You can mention that he worked as an engineering consultant for various companies, but don't provide specific details about projects or locations that might contradict our current background." The complexity of maintaining protected identities while nurturing genuine family relationships had become second nature after 5 years of practice, though we occasionally struggled with the sadness of erasing legitimate accomplishments and community contributions from our official histories. "Mom, I received an interesting call from Agent Morrison yesterday," Emma reported during our family gathering. "She said that federal agencies have been using evidence from our case to identify and prosecute money laundering operations by other international criminal organizations." "What kind of prosecutions?" Apparently, Dad's financial documentation provided insights into sophisticated money transfer techniques that several drug trafficking organizations have been using throughout the western United States. Chester had become an unofficial consultant to federal agencies investigating organized financial crimes, providing expertise about money laundering methods while maintaining his protected identity and security protocols. "Charles, how do you feel about your criminal participation ultimately helping federal authorities protect other families from similar coercion?" I asked. "I feel like our suffering served some useful purpose if it prevented other families from experiencing 8 years of criminal victimization. The knowledge I gained about cartel financial operations was acquired through trauma, but at least it's being used to prosecute genuine criminals. And how do you feel about Donovan spending the rest of his life in federal prison?" Chester paused before answering, apparently still processing complex emotions about his twin brother's criminal career and ultimate conviction. "I feel sad about the brother I lost in 1983 when Donovan chose criminal activities over family relationships. But I feel satisfied that the man who threatened our family and coerced me into criminal participation is facing appropriate consequences for 40 years of choices that destroyed communities and terrorized innocent people." That evening, after our children and grandchildren had returned to their own homes, Chester and I sat on our front porch reflecting on the extraordinary transformation our family had undergone since my discovery of his secret meetings with Donovan. "Vivian, do you regret placing that AirTag in my briefcase? Do you wish you'd never investigated my suspicious behavior?" "Charles, that investigation saved our family from indefinite criminal participation, while providing evidence that helped convict dozens of drug traffickers. If I hadn't been curious about your Friday meetings, we might still be living under cartel control. Or we might have been arrested as willing participants in money laundering operations." "Exactly. My surveillance probably saved us from federal prosecution while documenting criminal coercion that federal authorities needed to understand the scope of cartel operations." 6 months later, I received a call from Agent Morrison that would mark the final chapter of our involvement with federal law enforcement activities related to organized crime prosecution. Mrs. Barnes, I'm calling with news that will affect your family's long-term security status. Federal authorities have successfully disrupted the last known criminal organizations that might have posed continuing threats to witnesses from the Mendoza prosecutions. Agent Morrison, what does that mean for our protected status? It means that your family may be able to resume limited contact with previous communities and relationships, though we recommend maintaining your current identities for optimal security. So we could visit Portland or contact old friends. With appropriate precautions and security protocols, yes. The immediate threats that required complete isolation have been eliminated through successful prosecutions of affiliated criminal organizations. That summer, Chester and I made our first trip back to Portland since entering federal protection, visiting our old neighborhood under careful surveillance by federal agents who ensured our safety during emotional return to locations that held decades of memories. The house looks exactly the same, I observed, as we drove past our former home, now occupied by a young family who'd transformed our garden according to their own preferences. I feel strange seeing other people living in spaces where we raised our children and planned our retirement. Do you regret leaving Portland? I regret the circumstances that forced us to leave, but I don't regret choosing our family's safety over familiar surroundings. We visited Morrison's family restaurant, where Robert and I had shared countless meals during our 35 years of marriage, and Columbia River Credit Union, where we'd managed modest finances before discovering Chester's involvement in multi-million-dollar money laundering operations. It feels like visiting a previous life that belonged to different people, Chester reflected, as we toured locations that had defined our identity before criminal coercion changed everything about our family's circumstances and relationships. But Charles, we're the same people who lived here. We just have deeper appreciation for honesty and safety after surviving 8 years of criminal victimization. I placed an AirTag in my husband's briefcase because I thought he was having an affair when he started going to the same hotel every Friday. When I found bank records showing $6.3 million with his dead brother's name on the account, I discovered my husband wasn't cheating. He was being forced to launder money for drug cartels who threatened to kill our entire family if he stopped cooperating. The tracking device that was meant to catch infidelity ended up providing evidence that dismantled an international criminal organization and saved our family from 8 years of living under death threats. At 68, I was no longer Margaret Hartwell, the retired math teacher who'd lived quietly in suburban Portland. I was Vivian Barnes, federal witness whose surveillance and investigation had helped prosecute one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America while saving my family from indefinite coercion by drug trafficking operatives. The AirTag that had been intended to confirm marital infidelity had instead documented criminal conspiracy that required federal intervention, family relocation, and permanent identity changes to ensure our survival. But most importantly, our family had learned that love and trust could survive even the most devastating secrets when both partners chose honesty over continued deception and justice over personal safety. Some marriages ended when wives discovered their husbands' hidden activities. Our marriage had been strengthened through surviving criminal victimization together and building a new life based on truth rather than fear. The end.